My name is Russ Jaffe. I'm an internist and clinical pathologist physician. I'm a biochemist and physiologist and a certified clinical nutritionist. I'm a fellow of the American Society for Clinical Pathology, of the American College of Nutrition, of the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, of the Federation of Clinical Immunology Societies, and of the American Medical Laboratory Immunologists. I'm an overseas fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, a fellow of Health Studies Collegium Research Foundation, and director and founder of PERQUE Integrative Health and ELISA Act Biotechnologies. Well, let's start at the beginning with regard to the adrenal glands. What are the adrenal glands and what is their function? As you see on the right side of this slide, adrenal glands are really a fatty organ above the kidneys. They sit right on top of the kidneys. They get their blood supply very similarly to the kidneys. And so the adrenal gland is often anatomically referred to as the suprarenal gland, that is above the renal, above the kidney. The adrenals, as you see on the left, are composed of two major parts, an outer part, known as the adrenal cortex, and an inner part, known as the adrenal medulla. Cortex, outer, medulla, center. The cortex produces hormones. The cortex of the adrenals produces cortisol, aldosterone, testosterone, estrogens. Most anything you can make out of cholesterol can be made in the adrenal gland. In the center, in the medulla, are neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline, being the most common. Well, now let's look in a little bit of detail at the adrenal gland, brain, and body connections. And in this diagram, we start at the top, at the cortex, or the conscious brain, that learns about the world and sends that attitude, sends that chemical and electrical information to the hippocampus in the deep brain and the amygdala, that are then influenced or modulated by neurotransmitters and communicate with the deep brain, the hypothalamus, that then releases releasing factors. The hypothalamus literally drips chemicals onto the pituitary stalk that flow down to this special controller gland, sometimes called the master gland, the pituitary. And what happens from the pituitary? Well, the pituitary, in regard to the adrenal system, releases ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, the hormone that stimulates the adrenal glands. ACTH is the hormone that stimulates the adrenal gland. So when the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to release ACTH, that chemical goes to the adrenal gland, induces the increase of cortisol production and other hormones, and that cortisol has effects on circulation, but also effects on the immune system. And so while it increases your heart rate, it decreases your immune system's function. And then there are lots of feedbacks. So that cortisol in a healthy person goes back to the deep brain hypothalamus, goes back to the brain pituitary, and says, okay, I got the message, I got enough ACTH, now thanks for the cortisol, I don't need to produce more ACTH to continue that stimulation. So in a healthy person, there's healthy feedback. The brain tells the pituitary to tell the adrenal when more hormones are needed. Cortisol is the principal one of those hormones, and it impacts the immune defense and repair system as well as circulation and other parts of the body. Now, when the immune system is dialed down, immunotransmitters are released that stimulate the pituitary to send more activation to the immune system. And then neuropeptides come out of the brain that also tell the immune system to be more functionally enhanced. So an elegant interactive system. You see many kinds of cycles and circles, if you will, here. And that's the way physiology is. It's about ratios, it's about balance, it's not about absolutes or any particular single chemical. So this is an overview of the feedback between the brain, the deep brain, the conscious brain, the deep brain, the pituitary, and the adrenals or the immune system in the body. But what happens when things don't work quite right? What happens when you have Cushing's hyperadrenalism? Professor Cushing was a Harvard scientist. You see his picture in the upper left, and the microscope that's on his desk there to his right was absolutely state-of-the-art in about 1910 or so, or 1920 when this picture was taken. In Cushing syndrome, the adrenals are overly active. They weigh more. They're larger. They're 10 to 30 grams instead of 5 to 10 grams. And you see a picture here of Michael Santoro and his sister Paula. They are twins. They are twins. And yet Michael does not have Cushing syndrome. Paula does. We'll talk more about the difference in appearance, but here's a pair of twins, one of whom has normal adrenals, one of whom has Cushing syndrome, and you see the difference in stature, in facies, and in function. And to summarize, Cushing's adrenalism, hyperadrenalism, Cushing syndrome, can be summarized as the 7 dwarves of Cushing's: forgetful, chubby, bruisey, sleepy, hairy, angry, and psycho. So if you have people who come in and they say they're getting more forgetful than they were recently, they're having more difficulty with their weight management, they bruise more easily, they're more fatigued, and they are just more sleepy much of the time. They have hair growing where they didn't have it before. Their moods are more angry and reactive than they had been. So forgetful, chubby, bruisey, sleepy, hairy, angry, and psycho are the 7 dwarves of Cushing syndrome. And that's what we want you to remember as you're seeing people, because very often people come in with form fruits, incomplete expressions of either Cushing syndrome or other adrenal dysfunctions. And when you keep these kinds of clues in mind, you can help them to deal with their incomplete but still significant adrenal dysfunctions. Now, what about Addison's hypoadrenalism? So this is too low adrenal activity. In this case, the glands will typically weigh 1 to 5 grams rather than more. And if you look on the bottom right, you see a diagram. Addison's disease on the left, easy to diagnose and treat if you think about it. You do have to think about it. And there are 4 pictures here, little line drawings, one of a normal adrenal, one of an autoimmune Addison's patient where the autoimmune condition has overstimulated the adrenal gland to the point where it's exhausted and it's now depleted, it's now shrunk, it's now small, and it's less functional. One of the causes can be iron overload, or actually any oxidative imbalance. Another cause can be Addison's from tuberculosis in the gland itself, an infection that gets into the gland, or any chronic illness that takes over the body's cellular machinery and finds the adrenal tissue hospitable. Hypotension and hyperkalemia, high potassium and low blood pressure, occur. Risk of sudden death is greater. People tend to be weaker than they used to be. They notice that they are weaker. They get pigmentation that they otherwise did not have. They have trouble maintaining their weight. They tend to lose weight. They tend to be more nauseous more easily. And this kind of hypoadrenalism can be distinguished by an ACTH stimulation test. Remember, we talked about adrenocorticotrophic hormone, the hormone that comes out of the pituitary to stimulate the adrenal glands. The ACTH stimulation test is in a line drawing shown here, where the blood cortisol level after ACTH injection rises, but in adrenal insufficiency it does not. So if you have a problem where the adrenal is okay, but the pituitary is not giving the signal, then the ACTH stimulation test will find the adrenals able to release cortisol. And on the other hand, if you give the ACTH and the gland doesn't respond, then that suggests a true hypoadrenalism, an exhausted or less functional gland. So improvement suggests pituitary disease or secondary Addison syndrome. No improvement indicates primary adrenal disease. So you can have low adrenals either because your pituitary is pooped out or because your adrenal gland itself is pooped out. And one of the most famous people in American history who was Addisonian was President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. You see his picture. It's not Addison's picture in the upper center. But President Kennedy, if you look at his faces carefully, is a treated Addisonian, and that's his situation. On the far left, you see two images. The upper left image is from Netter's Atlas and shows you the many signs that you can look for in regard to Addison's hypoadrenalism. For example, certain pigmentation of the gingiva, low blood pressure, difficulty with weight, easy bruisability, and the like. And on the bottom, a detailed diagram that I'll now show a bit larger and walk through on the next slide. So Addison's hypoadrenalism is associated with the following. The hypothalamus in the deep brain releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH. That's the chemical that drips down the stalk to the anterior pituitary to release corticotropin, or ACTH, which then tells the adrenal glands to get going and produce aldosterone, androgens like testosterones, and hormones like cortisol. Now this cortisol should come back with a negative feedback to stop the cycle, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And we also want to point out that cortisol then goes to the liver, where the liver provides the 17-hydroxysteroids products. These then are active in the body. There are also 17 ketosteroids that come partly from the adrenals and partly modified through the liver. And both of these, when they're ready for excretion and the body is done with them, are released through the urine, but also through the sweat, and to a limited extent through the stool. So this is a diagram of how things go back and forth between brain and body continuously in regard to the risk of Addison's hypoadrenalism. Now let's look at this similar diagram to what we saw before, but in regard to Addison's hypoadrenalism. And here, again, we start at the top with the conscious brain and cortex that interacts with the hippocampus and amygdala, modulated by neurotransmitters, so that the hypothalamus, in this case, is overstimulating the pituitary. So there's so much ACTH coming out that cortisol goes up initially in both the circulation and its impact on the immune system, and that's a transient hyperadrenalism that then exhausts over time to produce hypoadrenalism. The negative feedback with cortisol still works. Neuropeptides and neurotransmitters still modulate. Adrenal hypertrophy is the first phase. Excess cortisol is released in that situation. And desensitization, as you see in the lower right, desensitization of cortisol receptors, increased activity of macrophages, and increased release of pro-inflammatory cytokines, the ones that are increased in the absence of repair and where we would rather have pro-repair rather than pro-inflammatory cytokines. Now let's look at the balancing hormones DHEA and cortisol. DHEA, or dehydroepiandrosterone, is a mother hormone. Many hormones are derived from it. It's the feel-good hormone. When you have enough DHEA in balance with cortisol, you're whistling a happy tune and feeling well. Now, for most people, DHEA levels tend to decrease with age. So for typical people, there's a peak at about 25 years of age, and then a decline at about 2% a year for typical people. Now, healthy people, in contrast, maintain healthy DHEA and cortisol levels throughout life. Cortisol, however, controls how the body makes and uses energy. You may have heard of it as the flight or fight hormone. We have rethought that as the flight, fight, or fortitude hormone. When you have imbalances, you either want to run away, flee, or you want to stay and resist. That's flight or fight. And there's another choice. The third choice is fortitude. When you have healthy resilience and balance, you're able to rise to the challenge without either running away or fighting, but having the fortitude to persevere successfully. Too much cortisol is bad, as is too little. Too little cortisol is even worse. Cortisol balance with other hormone rhythms enhances health. So when cortisol, DHEA are in a dynamic rhythm or balance or dance with each other, we're healthier. Let's look again to reinforce this message at adrenal hormones from cholesterol to cortisol et al. And cortisol produced in the adrenal glands in the cortex is the source and companion for androgens. The androgens in turn from DHEA that opposes cortisol. And then there are the glucocorticoids that stimulate sugar production. And cortisol wants more energy to be available. So cortisol says to the liver, for example, make more glucose, make more sugar so I can use that sugar for energy. In regard to the adrenal gland and this balance of cortisol and DHEA, let's follow the arrows. First, straight up, the cortisol DHEA influence carbohydrate metabolism, cell energetics, and glucose homeostasis. To the upper right, cortisol and DHEA influence detoxification capacity, the ability to remove heavy metals, environmental xenotoxins, and other hormones. Cortisol and DHEA also influence neural tissue health. This has to do with memory, learning, sleep, and mood. To the further clockwise, cortisol and DHEA influence adrenal endocrine function. This has to do with thyroid, pancreas, insulin, ovary, testes, and the like. Cortisol DHEA influence metabolism, has to do with weight, fat distribution and balance, protein turnover, and mucosal integrity. And cortisol and DHEA also influence the musculoskeletal system. This has to do with bone turnover, new bone growth, recycling of old bone, muscle integrity, connective tissue turnover, and the like. And finally, cortisol DHEA influence inflammation. They modulate or they alter inflammation, which is repair deficit. When there's enough of the DHEA to balance out the cortisol, then immune regulation, pro and anti-inflammatory responses balance out, and you get as much repair as you do activation and stimulus of inflammation. So cortisol and DHEA in balance, each essential and essential to have in reserve. And if we look at the fundamental physiology, which is about what we eat, drink, think, and do, you can think about infections, not the external agent, but your hospitality. Is your immune system susceptible to foreign invaders, to infections, without being able to recycle them and break them down? Are you allowing for infections to take root in the body? Physical stress, trauma, pain, poor nutrition, psychological distress, high blood sugar from taking in too many sugared and too few nutrient-rich foods. Chronic inflammation, that is repair deficit. And toxicities, the ability to detoxify, the inability to remove the toxic matter that causes adrenal resistance, elevated cortisol beyond what the DHEA can balance. So if cortisol and DHEA both go up, that's okay. But if cortisol goes up and DHEA can't keep up with it, that's a problem. And symptoms of high cortisol with inadequate DHEA to balance are high blood sugar, high blood pressure, insomnia, hypothyroidism, poor digestion, decreased immune function, and constipation. When you see any of those, when you see elevated blood sugar or blood pressure, when you see people with sleep issues or low thyroid symptoms, when you see people with poor digestion, decreased immune function, and constipation, think about adrenal distress, adrenal overexcitation leading to adrenal exhaustion, and an Addisonian-like condition. So internal learned responses, the internal responses to any external demand, these can be psychological, physical, or biochemical. And if we follow around from the top, it makes the body less able to respond to stress. Then more stress stimulates the adrenal gland to produce cortisol that over time causes adrenal exhaustion and low cortisol. So initially, both cortisol and DHEA go up, and that's okay, especially if they come down in balance. Then you reach a point where cortisol continues to go up and DHEA cannot keep up and goes down. That's the Cushing's hyperadrenalism state. And then eventually you get collapse of both cortisol and DHEA, the exhausted state, and that's the Addisonian condition. Now you can find out where a person is with a non-invasive test, an adrenal stress hormone measurement. And so adrenal stress hormone balance in plasma or saliva, you can either spit into the tube and measure it against saliva standards, or you can draw blood and do the plasma, but here you want the free cortisol, which is what you find in the saliva, not the bound cortisol or the total cortisol. So you'd want plasma-free cortisol or salivary cortisol and the free DHEA at the same time. And indeed, 4 different time points. So on rising 8 a.m., noon, 4 p.m., and 8 p.m. are typical times. If you have these slightly extended, if you start earlier and go later, you have slightly different ranges. But for ease, people can think about 8 a.m., noon, 4 p.m., and 8 p.m. For either salivary DHEA and cortisol or plasma DHEA and cortisol. And when you look at those 4 time points, you get a sense of the rhythm of the cortisol axis for the day and for the body. And here PERQUE Adrenal Distress Guard comes in because we've been able to rethink natural support. Tropho-restorative is the safer relief from high-tech living. A tropho-restorative formula doesn't force the adrenal glands to do anything. It doesn't inhibit the adrenal glands from doing anything. It makes it possible for the adrenal glands to restore balance. It helps support the adrenal glands in the transition back to balance. And it helps repair the HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, so that we can de-stress naturally. PERQUE Adrenal Distress Guard is also particularly helpful if restorative sleep is interfered with because of hormone imbalances and adrenal dysfunctions. And most importantly, PERQUE Adrenal Distress Guard is helpful to those who have sugar cravings. I was talking with a dear friend, Reese. She said, gee, I started PERQUE Adrenal Distress Guard. I noticed I didn't have the sugar cravings. And I went on a trip and I ran out of the PERQUE Adrenal Distress Guard. And after a week or so, I noticed that my sugar cravings were coming back and coming back strongly. And as soon as I got home, I started to take the PERQUE Adrenal Distress Guard again. And it took a few days before I really noticed that my adrenals were more resilient, that my sugar cravings at the end of the day or beginning of the day or during the intensity of the day just weren't happening. Because cortisol to DHEA rhythm changes equal healthier balance, and it's about balance that the hormones and adrenals of the body are best measured. And we did a study. We wanted to look at adrenal distress, and within just 6 weeks, in a clinical outcome study that's available from perq.com/?CAT=9, you will find the following kinds of study results. There were people who had low morning cortisol. And I should explain that you see 4 lines on this graph, 2 of which are reference, and 2 of which are before and then after. So the dark purple line is at time 0. This is what the person was when they started their program. And the pink or mauve line is after 6 weeks, with the yellow being the minimum and the turquoise being the maximum for that lab's healthy range. So if you were low in your first morning cortisol indicating exhaustion, you came up and showed better rhythm, as is seen in this mauve or magenta line. This person still needs some improvement, but to have this much improvement in HPA axis function starting from a low cortisol in the morning is really clinically remarkable, as the individuals who had the condition commented about how much better they were able to function and how much better they felt. And what if you had high cortisol in the morning? Because some people are hyper, and some people are hypo, and some people are in the middle. Well, if you had high cortisol and tended to crash later in the morning and through the afternoon, which is what the dark blue or purple line shows at time 0 here, you got better. That is, your morning was lower, still not into the healthier range, but better, and you had better rhythm at just 6 weeks after PERQUE adrenal distress scale. And what if you were okay? If you were within the usual range in the morning, as we see here, this person was slightly low and then in the evening really dropped out, but would be, for most people, an unremarkable HPA axis finding. After just 6 weeks, we see in the mauve or magenta line an improvement in morning cortisol and an improvement in rhythm. The evening cortisol is a bit high, as will happen as people go from poor to better rhythm. And with a need for deeper and restorative sleep, that will happen. If you like statistics, you can look with me here at the before and after for the population or the whole group. In this case, we did 7 a.m., 11 a.m., 5 p.m., and 10 p.m. as the times for the salivary cortisol and DHEA. And you see, on average for the whole group, and these were ambulatory people who were not diagnosed with adrenal disease, for the entire group, a significant, statistically significant, and below the 0.05 level, improvement in mean and rhythm over the day. And that's what the dark line below with the better mauve line above says, that we went from tired and somewhat exhausted on average to better and more functional after just 6 weeks. And we also thought to look at the impact of adrenal function on blood sugar. And insulin resistance improved in 6 weeks. There was a 28% improvement in HOMA using the homeostatic model assessment, a 38% improvement in glucose-insulin ratio. So before, you see on the left, a glucose to insulin ratio where higher is better, and you go from 3.89 to 6.25. And on the right, where HOMA lower is better, you went from 5.72 to 4.1. And by these two separate measurements of insulin resistance, there was improvement in just 6 weeks. Here's another individual. 38% improvement in HOMA, 34% improvement in glucose insulin, again in just 6 weeks. Now there are predictive markers, and these have to do with a combination of factors that I'd like to briefly review with you. If you start in the upper left, blood sugar is very important, and we want a hemoglobin A1C of less than 6. In the upper right, we see detoxification, and we want a homocysteine of less than 6. And this influences blood pressure, reactive oxygen species, antioxidant status, and the like. In the lower right, we see that we want a high sensitivity CRP of less than 0.5. And on the lower left, and oxidized HDL, LDL, and 8-oxoguanine that are as close to zero as possible. And what are the implications of this? When you have high oxidation, high oxidized blood fats, you'll likely have abdominal fat, endothelial dysfunction, nitrous oxide dysfunction, and organ damage from lack of repair. When you have problems with both repair and detoxification, then as you see on the middle right, you have the androgenic hirsutism, the PCOS syndrome, you have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, you have non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, NASH, you have acanthosis nigrans, or the liver spots, all of which relate to defects in both repair and detoxification. And if you look at the left in the middle, you see that imbalances of blood sugar and oxidation and antioxidants are associated with prothrombotic factors, things that activate or make more sticky the platelets, increase the risk of blood clotting, generally increase the turnover and levels of fibrinogen, another blood clotting protein. So by looking at these predictive markers and setting the goal values, we can identify risks early and we can take action to address them at least as early. So if you have hemoglobin A1C that is above 6, blood sugar will go up. If you have homocysteine above 6, detoxification will go down and blood pressure will go up. And reactive oxygen species and oxidizing ozone will increase. Free fatty acids will go up. Blood fats will get higher. Platelets will be more reactive, stickier. Fibrinogen and blood clotting will be enhanced. There'll be a decrease in nitric oxide endothelial function. And insulin will go up, but be less effective, so that you'll have organ damage from lack of repair. So we want to look at these predictive markers and reset our goals to their best, lowest risk, highest gain levels. Upper left, hemoglobin A1C less than 6. Upper right, homocysteine less than 6. Lower right, HSCRP less than 0.5. And oxidized HDL, LDL, and 8-oxoguanine near 0. So adrenal distress and metabolic syndrome go together. Indeed, learned chronic stress and insulin resistance go together. The external stressor is one issue. The internal learned response is what actually determines the help or harm from that external stimulus. So in regard to adrenal distress, metabolic syndrome, and endurance, it is about what we eat, drink, think, and do. And these are our habits of adrenal and metabolic health. So, eat foods that can be digested, assimilated, utilized, and eliminated without harm. Make water your beverage of choice, including through herbal beverages, fruit spritzers, and other herbal beverages. At least half of the fluids you take in should be from water. Then stretch and move the body until it's tired. If you want to know how much exercise is needed and each part of the body that is exercised properly gets stronger, each part of the body that is not exercised begins to atrophy. And a mindfulness or proactive meditation practice so that your mind and body move in harmony and in thought resilience. So metabolic syndrome and adrenal distress really do go together. Metabolic syndrome, if we start from the top arrow, is associated with hypertension, obesity, especially abdominal obesity, risk of diabetes and prediabetes, insulin dysregulation, atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, dyslipidemia, abnormal blood fats. And for the adrenal distress side, when we have eustress, we have balance. We have a balance of DHEA and cortisol. They go up and down together. In distress initially, in the Cushing's phase, if you will, cortisol goes up and DHEA goes down. And then, if you will, in the later exhausted or Addisonian phase, they both go down, both cortisol and DHEA. So in regard to blood sugar and insulin, we can start with the liver, which is influenced by both insulin. The liver is influenced by both insulin and blood glucose. And insulin stimulates glucose or sugar production, and insulin also triggers the uptake of sugar by cells. Secretion by the pancreatic islet cells triggers blood sugar to go up. Insulin senses that. Then insulin is released by the pancreatic islet cells to bring blood sugar down. And when insulin reaches the liver, it tells the liver to make more glucose because that's indicative of what the insulin functionality is all about. So insulin also increases sugar uptake in muscle cells, where fat is made from sugar as an energy store, and the receptors become resistant if too much insulin comes in too often. Anything that you're exposed to with increased intensity and frequency, the body tends to dial down or adapt to and become resistant and unresponsive to. So we want a little bit of insulin to go a long way. We don't want a lot of insulin to go a little way. And in regard to cortisol and insulin production, we can think about the stress response as follows. At some point, we get hungry and we eat. Insulin then recognizes the increase in sugar and cortisol. Insulin comes out. High fat generation occurs for a period of time. Then the insulin goes away because the blood sugar is adequate and energy production is fine. And then we get hungry again and we start the same cycle. But in regard to cortisol, it should have a rhythm that is not just dependent on every meal. People who have to eat, lest they get jittery or agitated, are not showing a healthy cortisol, but actually an excessive cortisol response. So in terms of metabolic syndrome, cells in distress, cortisol and DHEA imbalance is linked. We now know that in regard to specifics like metabolic syndrome, diabetes, adrenal function, 8% is genetic, 92% is lifestyle. 8% is due to our genes, 92% is due to our choices. The next point is that insulin resistance and abdominal obesity are all too common, and what is common can be considered typical, but it's not healthy. And when we have insulin resistance and abdominal obesity, we'll have elevated blood fats, dyslipidemia, high blood pressure, hypertension, glucose intolerance, and either prediabetes and metabolic syndrome, syndrome X, or actual diabetes itself. As we've said several times, inflammation is lack of repair. It's an obstacle to recovery. We want to promote repair. We want to remove obstacles to recovery so that in adrenal function and in the whole body function, we have a high repair competence and we don't have a deficit that leads to inflammation. So the Alkaline Way is here to evoke human healing responses. In the 30 to 40 years that I have been doing my best to scout and assimilate and then synergistically bring together healing approaches, the Alkaline Way is the synthesis of all of that. Evoking human healing responses is an approach that we think has much to commend it and that we've been using for the last decades with considerable success. And this clinically is reduced to the WellGuard program, a physiology-first approach to restore competences, restore immune tolerance, restore neurohormonal balance, restore digestive and detoxification abilities, restore competences in the immune, neurohormonal, digestive, and detoxification systems so that the body can once again be resilient and function at a high level. So PERQUE Integrative Health has 3 steps in its fundamental approach. Step 1 is a health assessment questionnaire. Step 2 are LRA by ELISA Act tests to find hidden allergens. And Step 3, a personalized PERQUE supplementation program as needed. This Alkaline Way is about eating what you can digest, assimilate, and eliminate within healthy homeostasis or immune tolerance. And our conclusion is that an alkaline diet saves lives. So, our immune system is very important to us. We want it to be resilient and tolerant, but all too often it's burdened. And while we need to identify and stop the burdens on the immune system are what make us hospitable hosts to pathogens, are what make allergens provoke symptoms, are what defers repair because defense work has to come first. So we recommend LRA by ELISA ACT tests, functional tests to identify the causes of immune overload, type 2, the functional antibodies, measuring only the harmful and not the helpful ones, type 3, the immune complexes, type 4, the cell-mediated responses, identified and measured concurrently in a mixed cell autologous system that uses the patient's plasma as the incubation medium and is performed as an ex vivo procedure. That is, the body reacts in the laboratory just as it does inside itself. The benefits of the Alkaline Way are to neutralize excess cell acids, to sustain healthful cell systems in very efficient ways. When our cell is slightly alkaline, efficiency of protein synthesis can be 95 to 100%. With a little bit of metabolic acidosis, that efficiency or accuracy of protein synthesis can fall to maybe 10%, which means the body has to recycle 90% of abnormal proteins, and that is a burden on the cell. So the Alkaline Way benefits including restoring digestive and immune system health, regaining tolerance to immune reactivities, and resetting the immune system to a resilient and highly tolerant state. There are some self-assessments that are important, and particularly in terms of these predictive biomarkers. First morning urine pH is one of those tests. There are separate webinars on this in detail, but the morning urine pH after 6 hours or more of rest is a non-invasive measure of what's going on at the cellular level, because after 6 hours or more, the urine in the bladder equilibrates with the bladder and kidney cells, and a healthy repair restore zone for pH is 6.5 to 7.5. It's just in that neutral pH range. If you're above pH of 7.5, you might have catabolic illness that cannibalizes you and tears you down. And if you're less than 6.5, you may have excess acid that wears you out. We don't want to have too much acid to wear us out. We don't want to have catabolic illness to tear us down. We want to be in the healthy, resilient 6.5 to 7.5 range, which means we're taking in enough buffering minerals to overcome the metabolic acids produced each day. And we recommend a first morning urine pH assessment tracking tool where people record the date, the time, the pH level, and how they feel on a 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 scale. And you find people linking their times of lower pH, more acid readings in their urine with more symptoms and less resilience. And conversely, when they're in the 6.5 to 7.5 range, they're feeling and functioning better. And when they bring that to your attention, it's helpful to reinforce that as a teaching moment and as a tool. To do the test, we recommend the Hypradrenalism test paper with a range of 5.5 to 8. And after more than 6 hours of rest, wet 2 to 3 inches of the strip with that first urine. If you're too acid, it'll stay yellow. If you're healthy, it'll turn green. If you're too alkaline, it'll turn blue. For more information on this urine pH testing, see The Joy of Food, the Alkaline Way Guide, available from www.perque.com, and it's particularly page 12 of The Joy of Food, the Alkaline Way Guide that discusses this. There are food and chemical effects on the body, and we have a chart that we've updated for over 2 decades now that shows the more and less alkaline and acid-forming foods. So we recommend a diet full of staples. 60 to 80% of what you eat should be whole fruits and vegetables, lentils, pulses, and beans, nuts, seeds, and sprouts, herbs, sea salt, and umeboshi vinegar, duck and quail eggs. And modest intake, 20% if you're getting better, 40% if you're well. Modest intake of meat, milk, chicken, eggs, most oils, some fruits and vegetables, and this is detailed in that food effects table that I just described. So inflammation rethought as lack of repair. We can understand the obstacles to recovery and address them, and we can reduce concurrently cardiovascular risk, diabetes, especially adult diabetes risk, Alzheimer's and other brain dysfunctions, arthritis and other autoimmune diseases, neurologic, pulmonary diseases, and cancers. Now, to review for a moment these biomarkers and their least risk, highest gain values, we want to look at inflammation and repair. And here the high sensitivity CRP, less than 0.5 milligrams per deciliter, is recommended. We want to detoxify and be able to methylate in a healthy way. And here homocysteine, less than 6 micromoles per liter, is recommended. For sugar, insulin, and energy, a hemoglobin A1C of less than 6 milligrams per deciliter is recommended. That's hemoglobin A1C of less than 6 milligrams per deciliter is recommended. Oxidation and antioxidant status, you would have an oxidized HDL, LDL, and 8-oxoguanine that were essentially not detectable. Vitamin D, 25-hydroxy-D level of 50 to 80 nanograms per ml, and an acid-alkaline metabolic status assessment of the first urine after rest, and to keep that in the 6.5 to 7.5 range. Stress hormone balance is really important. That's the cortisol DHEA balance that we've been describing, and the alkaline way that restores, repairs, renews, and defends the body is what the alkaline way indeed is about. We've developed a novel meal, and we're excited about the low glycemic load benefits of this whole foods meal. PERQUE WayGuard and WayGuard Repair have the lowest glycemic load less than 10. PERQUE WayGuard can be compared to the equivalent carbohydrates from food. So if you take 50 grams from bread and jam, you see the blue line, which starts at the same as the red on the far left. That is, the blood sugar for the both groups was the same at the start. At 15 minutes, they're similar. But at 30, 45, 60, and even 90 minutes, the bread and jam group, the people who had their blood sugar influenced by eating 50 grams of carbohydrates using bread and jam, showed a substantial increase in blood sugar at 30 minutes, at 45 minutes, at 60 minutes, at 90 minutes, compared to the red squares, which was blood glucose, after 50 grams of carbohydrate from PERQUE WayGuard. Now that's about 3 meals worth, or 2.5 meals worth of PERQUE WayGuard. So PERQUE WayGuard doesn't have anywhere near that much total carb. But if you have blood glucose after 50 grams of PERQUE WayGuard, you see how remarkably stable the blood sugar levels are. This indicates that blood sugar comes in slowly as needed. It doesn't rush in. Insulin doesn't get released because the blood sugar doesn't rise. And you have a much healthier and productive period of time where people can concentrate and work without having their blood sugar rock and roll or go up and come down fast. So at 2.5 times the usual dose, we only see a fractional blood sugar change with PERQUE WayGuard and PERQUE WayGuard Repair. So these are meals. They are newly derived. They are our proprietary contribution to science, PERQUE WayGuard and PERQUE WayGuard Repair, with essential available nutrients and ultra low glycemic load, and this novel meal ready to help today. The PERQUE WayGuard Repair includes 500 milligrams of quercetin dihydrate and additional soluble low molecular weight OPC, and both contain 15 grams of 100% native whey protein done by a special counterflow technique that preserves integrity and activity. We also want to make you aware that PERQUE Glucose Regulation Guard is new and reformulated as PERQUE Glucose Regulation Guard Forte. This enhances glucose transport activity. This also boosts energy levels with the most active forms of standardized corosolic acid, then French lilac, bitter melon, huckleberry or bilberry, each of which separately and synergistically together improves insulin function and action. So we activate glucose transport, we reverse insulin resistance with this combination of natural products. We then include chromium to enhance glucose tolerance factor action to metabolize sugar, and vanadium as the ascorbate for safer, better glucose regulation, and we include agnus castus for better pituitary or HPA axis hormonal regulation. For more information on this glucose regulation guard Forte breakthrough, see www.perque.com/PGRGF. So what would we recommend for someone with adrenal fatigue and metabolic syndrome? We would start with PERQUE Adrenal Distress Guard, 2 to 4 soft gels a day. We would include PERQUE Glucose Regulation Guard Forte, 4 to 8 soft gels a day. PERQUE EPA DHEA Guard, 4 soft gels a day. And we would consider adding PERQUE Metabolipid Detox Plus Guard, 6 per day if blood fats are elevated and for the period of time they are, because this most active carnitine in the fumarate form is the shovel that brings fat fuel to the furnace of the cell. And for those who are challenged with energy or weight, we add PERQUE WayGuard or WayGuard Repair, 1 scoop as a snack twice a day or 2 scoops as a meal once a day, with or without PERQUE Repair Guard or PERQUE Pain Guard to further stimulate repair and reverse the deficits. So we recommend choosing life. And since 92% of heart, blood vessel, and stroke risk is choice, we choose to be in the 1 in 2 rather than the 1 in 200 rather than the 1 in 2 group. In other words, if you pay attention to the 92% of heart, blood vessel, and stroke risk that's under your control and choice, you have a less than 1 in 200 chance of having heart, blood vessel, and stroke problems. On the other hand, if you ignore the issues and are a typical American, you have a 1 in 2 chance of a major heart, blood vessel, or stroke expression. So choosing life is 92% within our choice, and the other 8% we can modulate to a large extent through regenerative medicine rather than degenerative medicine. So let's choose life. Let's look at what we eat and drink, think, and do in those choices. And to summarize, a friend of mine, don't sweat the small stuff. It's all small stuff. And you can't do anything about the big stuff anyway, so choose life. Enjoy and be well.